You're about to discover how one of the most powerful institutions in the world built millions on top of human flesh. And no, we're not talking about modern corporations. We're talking about the church, the same one that preaches love thy neighbor and eternal salvation. In 1838, Jesuit priests sold 272 human beings like cattle, received the equivalent of $3.3 million today, and saved a university from bankruptcy. That university is now called Georgetown. But this is just one chapter. The real story is much, much worse. Get ready to discover how the money of faith was built with blood, chains, and monumental hypocrisy. For over a century, the Catholic Church in the United States financed its territorial expansion, evangelizing missions and educational institutions with profits from slavery. Without the enslaved, the American Catholic Church as we know it today simply would not exist. Priests prayed for the salvation of the souls of the people they themselves owned, bought, and sold as merchandise. The Jesuit order, founded in 1540 with the mission to defend and spread the Catholic faith through education and missionary work, became in the 18th century one of the largest slaveholders in the Americas, controlling over 20,000 enslaved people. They justified this active participation in slavery as a means to convert these souls to Catholicism. God was on their side, apparently. The Maryland Jesuits, in particular, acquired vast tracts of land in the Chesapeake Bay region to produce tobacco for export to Europe. Properties like St. Inigo's, established in 1637, St. Thomas Manor in 1649, Newtown in 1668, Bohemia in 1704, White Marsh in 1728, and St. Joseph's Church in 1765, formed an agricultural empire sustained by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. By 1790, the 5 large Jesuit plantations and smaller properties totaled approximately 13,000 acres, worked by about 323 enslaved people. These plantations weren't just economic enterprises, they were also missionary centers, where Jesuits sought to convert those they held in captivity. In a moral contradiction so grotesque it borders on surreal, the tobacco cultivated by enslaved hands financed colleges, seminaries, churches, and the entire infrastructure of the religious order. Millions in dirty money from this abominable trade were invested in the education and training of priests and seminarians belonging to the Jesuit congregation and other religious orders. Additionally, a large portion of the fees emanating from the mass baptisms of enslaved Africans, performed hastily by missionary priests before these slaves embarked on their one-way journey to the West Indies, flowed directly into the coffers of the Catholic Church in Portugal, Spain, and Rome. The Church didn't just profit from slave labor, it also charged to bless those who would be sold like cattle. In 1548, Pope Paul III used his apostolic authority to declare the slave trade legal in the eyes of the Church, empowering the religious monarchies of European nations to continue engaging in the transatlantic trade. Popes and their friends accepted gifts of enslaved people sent from Africa to Rome. Through the transatlantic trade, the Church systematically extended its influence. European enslavers baptized millions of enslaved people, whose labor they used to accumulate vast wealth. Slavery had divine blessing, at least that's what the popes said, while lining their pockets. The situation became so financially unsustainable in the 1820s and 1830s that the Maryland Jesuits faced a brutal dilemma. The plantations were in deplorable condition due to mismanagement, unprofitable contracts, useless and expensive experiments, and mounting debts. The tobacco soil was exhausted, and there was no longer demand for large numbers of enslaved people in the region. In 1814, the Jesuits adopted a resolution calling for gradual emancipation of enslaved workers over several years. This resolution, however, resulted in no immediate action and was formally rejected in 1820. The chosen solution was much more pragmatic and much more profitable: sell everything at once. And so we arrive at June 19, 1838. Jesuit priests Thomas Mulledy and William McSherry sold 272 enslaved people to Louisiana Sugar, plantation owner Jesse Beatty, and former Louisiana Congressman Henry Johnson. The objective was to help Georgetown College, now known as Georgetown University, avoid financial ruin. This transaction is considered the largest mass sale of enslaved people in United States history. It also represents the largest documented group of enslaved people, known by first and last names, to have been owned by an educational or religious institution in the United States and sold by priests ordained by the Roman Catholic Church. The deal was valued at about $115,000 at the time, equivalent to approximately $3.3 million today. Subsequent research revealed the sale may have included at least 314 men, women, and children, some of whom remained in Maryland. Mulledy and his allies argued they were selling people to Louisiana, a Catholic place, so families could continue practicing their religion. They also argued the large plantations meant buyers would be able to maintain large numbers of enslaved people and keep families together. Basically, they said, "We're selling all these people, but it won't be so bad. We'll build a chapel for them there." At the same time, however, they knew black people were desperately terrified of the Deep South, and with good reason, due to brutal working conditions. And in the end, families were separated in the sale, despite what they had promised Rome. Cultivating and harvesting sugarcane was harder and more dangerous than harvesting cotton. Slaves worked constantly during harvest season to cut the cane by hand, press the juice from the cane, and then boil it. Workers were frequently mutilated in the fields, or during the pressing process, or burned during boiling. Beatty owned a 2,800-acre sugar plantation in Maringouin in Iberville Parish, along with lands in Pointe Coupée Parish. It was to these plantations of horror that the 272 were sent. Not to pray, to bleed, but this story isn't exclusive to Catholics. The Church of England also had blood-stained hands. Queen Anne's Bounty, a corporation created by statute in 1703-1704 to increase maintenance for poor clergy, invested heavily in the slave trading activities of the South Sea Company. This company, which received the monopoly on slave trade with South America in 1713, at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, transported more than 34,000 enslaved people across the Atlantic. It's estimated the company managed to land just under 30,000 in its relatively brief period of operation just before the mid-18th century. Forensic accountants and academics who examined historical records and various documents associated with Queen Anne's Bounty discovered the organization received numerous contributions from individuals who likely profited from transatlantic slavery. This included well-known individuals like Edward Colston, whose statue was toppled in Bristol Harbor during Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Queen Anne's Bounty had invested the equivalent of £443 million in current terms by 1739. When the South Sea Company ceased trading enslaved people, the organization continued to invest in the South Sea Company until the end of the 18th century. In total, these investments generated revenue of £1.4 billion in current terms for Queen Anne's Bounty. In January 2023, the Church of England publicly admitted its involvement in the 18th century transatlantic slave trade and allocated £100 million sterling, approximately $121 million, to rectify injustices arising from its associations with slavery. Gareth Mostyn, chief executive of the Church Commissioners, told BBC Radio, "There is no doubt that the South Sea Company was involved in enslavement, and that is a source of real shame for us, for which we apologize. Apologies. As if apologies pay for centuries of torture, family separation, forced labor, and death." While Baptists in the South played the most vocal role in defending the institution of slavery before the Civil War, other denominations, including the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Catholic Church, and other religious educational institutions, all benefited from slave labor in some form. Whether clergy members or the churches themselves owning enslaved people, or churches receiving tithes from congregants in the form of tobacco cultivated by enslaved people, the wealth of churches was deeply intertwined with the slave trade. Into the 20th century, churches and their clergy also played an active role in defending segregation and redlining policies. Now stop for a second and think. If you could go back in time and confront those priests, bishops, and popes who profited from slavery while preaching divine love, what would you say to them? Do you believe these religious institutions have truly paid their moral debt to descendants of the enslaved? Or is this just corporate theater to clean up their image? Leave your opinion in the comments because we need to talk about this without hypocrisy. The moral contradiction is so profound, it's nauseating. The Jesuits professed values of equality and human dignity, yet they actively participated in and profited from systems that dehumanized individuals. Some Jesuits questioned the morality of slavery and advocated better treatment of enslaved people. Still, the institution as a whole frequently justified its actions as necessary for the survival of its missions. In other words, they continued to do something bad so good could come from it. These tensions underlined the broader complexities of the Catholic Church's relationship with slavery during the colonial era. The history of Jesuits in South America presents another equally problematic model. They implemented a different labor system through a scheme called reductions, involving paternalistic exploitation of indigenous peoples in Paraguay and surrounding regions. The Jesuits aimed to protect indigenous communities from external enslavement by organizing them into self-sufficient Christian communities. However, these reductions imposed strict control over indigenous labor and daily life, leading to accusations of paternalistic exploitation. While the reductions offered some protection, they also reinforced systems of forced labor under the guise of religious instruction and cultural assimilation. God justified everything, always. Rachel Swarns, author of the book The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church, wrote, "Without the enslaved, the Catholic Church in the United States as we know it today would not exist." She says priests prayed for the salvation of the souls of the people they owned, even while buying and selling their bodies. In 2016, Swarns wrote an article in the New York Times titled 272 Slaves Were Sold to Save Georgetown. What does it owe their descendants? That article led two descendants of the family she writes about in the book to meet. As of May 2019, only 425 direct descendants of the named group had been located. But the Georgetown Memory Project believes there are approximately 12,000 to 15,000 descendants, both living and deceased, across 49 family groups. Georgetown University announced in October 2022 the creation of a fund to grant $400,000 annually to community-based projects that can impact descendants of the men, women, and children enslaved on Jesuit plantations in Maryland. The Reconciliation Fund, which was inspired by a 2019 undergraduate student referendum, began accepting applications for projects to benefit descendant communities, many of whom live in and around Maringouin, Louisiana, where their ancestors were sold and forcibly moved in 1838. $400,000 per year for over 12,000 descendants. Do the math, it's less than crumbs. In March 2021, the Jesuit order committed $100 million to atone for slave labor and sales. But Jesuit leaders prevailed in 1838, signing an agreement to sell 272 men, women, and children in one of the largest recorded slave sales of the era. That money saved Georgetown, built the infrastructure, paid professors, financed expansions. And now, almost 2 centuries later, the institution offers a microscopic fraction of what it gained to try to cleanse its collective conscience. Religious institutions were not passive victims of slavery. They were active participants, architects, and direct beneficiaries. Slavery serves as the foundation of today's financial services sector. Private actors like banks and other actors in the housing and financial sector built their empires on this bloody foundation. Religion wasn't outside this equation. It was at the center of it. Priests, bishops, popes all profited. And when slavery finally ended, many of these institutions continued to advocate segregation and redlining policies into the 20th century. Today, our contemporary institutions are deeply connected to slavery. As Rachel Swarns states, this is not this faceless, amorphous thing. These are people. They have names, and we are connected to this history today. Descendants of the 272 people sold by the Jesuits still live. They carry the weight of this history in their bodies, in their communities, in their limited opportunities. Meanwhile, Georgetown University continues to be one of the most prestigious and wealthy educational institutions in the United States. With an endowment of billions of dollars, the Catholic Church's involvement in slavery revealed significant economic and theological contradictions. As a religious order, they professed values of equality and human dignity, yet they actively participated in and profited from systems that dehumanized individuals. Some Jesuits questioned the morality of slavery and advocated better treatment of enslaved people. Still, the institution as a whole frequently justified its actions as necessary for the survival of its missions. The logic was simple and cruel. Do evil so good could happen. Enslave to evangelize. Torture to save souls. This isn't just ancient history. The effects of church-sponsored slavery reverberate today. Wealth disparities, limited access to education, generational trauma, destroyed communities. All of this has direct roots in the actions of these religious institutions. And when these institutions finally admit their guilt, they offer ridiculous amounts compared to what they profited. $100 million from the Church of England. $100 million from the Jesuits. $400,000 per year from Georgetown. These aren't reparations. They're public relations. Think about it. The church built cathedrals, universities, hospitals, seminaries, all with blood-stained money. Every brick laid, every stained glass window installed, every altar erected was financed by the sweat, tears, blood of people who never had a choice. People who were ripped from their lands, chained on ships, sold like cattle, forced to work until death, all while priests prayed for their souls and counted the profits. The hypocrisy couldn't be more brutal. And let's not forget, these weren't marginal institutions. They were the most powerful institutions in the Western world. The Vatican, the Church of England, religious orders with global influence. They had the power to change the system. Instead, they chose to profit from it, chose to defend slavery theologically, chose to baptize slaves before loading them to their deaths, charging fees for the privilege, chose to accumulate wealth while preaching poverty and humility to the faithful. Today, when you visit Georgetown University, you walk through a beautiful campus full of history and prestige. But beneath every building, beneath every manicured lawn, beneath every commemorative plaque, lies the blood of the 272 people sold in 1838, and of all the other enslaved people who labored and died on Jesuit plantations for over a century. Their stories were erased, their names forgotten, their contributions denied. Until recently, no one talked about this. It was a dirty secret buried under layers of academic respectability and religious piety. The truth is that the wealth of faith was built with chains. The finances of religion were funded with human flesh, and when finally confronted with this truth, these institutions offer empty apologies and insufficient funds, hoping time and distance will erase the memory. But memory persists, in descendants, in historical records, in sale documents that list human beings as property, with monetary values next to their names, children valued at less than adults, families separated to maximize profits. This is the story religious institutions don't want you to tell. This is the inconvenient truth that contradicts centuries of narratives of benevolence and charity. The church didn't save the enslaved. The church enslaved them. These weren't isolated exceptions. It was institutional policy for over 2 centuries. Approved by popes, executed by priests, justified by theologians. And when it finally ended, it wasn't because of moral conscience. It was because economics changed, society changed, slavery became politically unsustainable. Not from goodness, from pragmatism. The billions the church accumulated from slavery shaped the global economy, financed the expansion of Christianity in the Americas, paid for the construction of institutions that still exist today. And now, when confronted, these institutions offer impact funds, reconciliation programs, historical research, but they don't return the wealth, don't redistribute the power, don't fundamentally transform the structures they built on this bloody foundation. And so, we reach the end of this story. Or is it the end? Because the truth is, this story continues in descendants still fighting for recognition, continues in wealth disparities that still exist, continues in institutions that still benefit from this accumulated wealth. The church that made billions from slavery still exists, still powerful, still wealthy, and still fundamentally hasn't paid its debt. 400 years of slavery aren't compensated with $100 million and some apologies. But maybe that's the point. Maybe there was never real intention to compensate. just to look like they're trying. And in this game of appearances, the church has always been master.